This is the Detroit Sports Podcast Network.
The Wolverines are halfway through training camp, and we will get a progress report on this week's episode of Michigan Podcast next.
But there's going to be one team that's going to play solely as a team. No man is more important than the team. No coach is more important than the team. The team, the team, the team.
Looks deeper in the corner. Waits for it. It's caught.
This is no time for that. In the pocket and a sack. Tim Jamison. Brady gets terrific.
Throws it, get it, touchdown, Knight again. Schultz just before Frizzell got him, and a leaping interception by Woodson.
Harbaugh back to throw over the middle. Caught by Colliver at the 5 on his feet. Touchdown, Michigan. On its way. It's good.
He's 5'7", 179 pounds, a junior at Michigan. But Jamie Morris packs a wallop, and he delivers for Bo Schembechler.
And here's your first play. Pressure coming, sack. It is Glenn Steele, number 81, who fought his way through the traffic.
Option. And Robinson calls his own number, and he's going to score. Oh, an easy touchdown for Ron Robinson and Michigan.
The MVP in today's ball game. You want to know who it is? I'm standing alongside his proud daddy, quarterback Brian Greasy of Michigan.
Go Blue, welcome to this week's episode of Michigan Podcast. My name is Steve Deace. It's an honor to have you with us. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at Michigan Podcast. If you ever miss any episodes at all, by the way, you can find those on our website at michiganpodcast.com. Subscribe to us via iTunes, Google Play, and Stitcher. We have a new partner, by the way, Detroit Sports Podcast. We want to welcome them as our new partners here for the Michigan Podcast. They're going to help us get the word out about the podcast edition of this show each and every week. And then, of course, there's the old faithfuls, our original YouTube subscribers. We crossed over 21,000 views of our episodes so far. Pretty good for a little mom and pop stand like us, barely able to get the word out beyond word of mouth. Thank you to all of you. I try to respond to as many of the comments on our YouTube channel page as I possibly can. And click like on this video, share that link, subscribe to us on YouTube. The more people we can get access to what we're doing at Michigan Podcast, the more Michigan fans we can reach. I hear this so often, man, you guys do a great job. If only more people could hear about this. Well, that's where you come in. You can help us to reach more Michigan fans via the Michigan Podcast. Also, that leads me to a little housekeeping item to start things off. You know, a lot of you have said, hey, could you do more of these a week? Could you do more of this a week? And the answer is yes. And it ties into another question we get sometimes, which is, hey, how can we help you guys out? Well, this past week, we decided to start our own Patreon page for Michigan Podcast. If you like what we do, if you dig it, if you think we're a good information source, and you just want to, contribute $1 a month to what we're doing here as a way of saying thank you, that is greatly appreciated. Now, if you join our Patreon page for $5 a month, you're going to get access to what we're going to start September the 2nd, our Game Day Reaction podcast. We will post that after every Michigan football game this fall. That'll be exclusive for our Patreon members, as well as access to my picks of all the big games in college football, my stone cold upsets and lead pipe locks that I put out each and every week. You'll get early access to all of those as well, exclusively through our Patreon page. So the description of this video contains the link to that page, or you can just go to Patreon and search for Michigan Podcast. Thank you for everything you're doing to help us get the word out. Coming up later on in this week's episode, Chris Balas of the Wolverine is going to take us inside Michigan training camp, but want to start with some of the observations that were made over the weekend by the Big Ten Network. They are doing their annual camp tours, which are always must-see viewing if you are a Big Ten or even any kind of a college football fan. On Friday, they were at the University of Michigan's practice and then did a show Friday night where they shared some of their observations. I want to go through a few of those to open up our episode this week and comment on some of the things the Big Ten Network had to say. One of the things Howard Griffith pointed out is that he thought several of Michigan's newcomers were better than the guys that they lost. Now, we as fans like to say stuff like that. You know, we always think the new guy is younger, faster, more talented, and more athletic than the guy you replaced, right? There's two constants in college football fandom. Every team that wins a bowl game is a young team that has everybody coming back next year. Right? It's like the NFL never drafts anybody. I don't know what the hell they do with that NFL draft. 7 rounds every year, and they just sit around. Nope. All the good teams have everybody coming back, so we're not drafting anybody. But thank you for watching 19 hours on the NFL Network as we boo the commissioner every pick. I mean, every team says this. Every team that wins a bowl game is a young team that has everybody coming back next year. Everybody says that, right? That's one constant of college football fandom. The other is, well, these new guys were more highly recruited and they're better and more athletic. Now, sometimes that's true, particularly when you've had a coaching change in an elite school, like what you saw from Mike Shula and Nick Saban at Alabama, for example, or what you're seeing now with Jim Harbaugh from Brady Hoke. So that can be true, right? Just like it can be true that your team won a bowl game, so they have momentum going into the offseason, and they're a really young team, and they got a lot of guys coming back. That can be true. It just can't be true of every team. Okay, it can also be true that the young guys are better and more athletic. It just can't be true of every team. Well, it appears Howard Griffith is affirming some of what Michigan fandom is hoping, thinking, praying, that these new guys that were very highly recruited are as good, if not better, than some of the guys they're replacing. And hey, to be fair, we've even had some former Michigan players like Chris Wormley on his way out the door say, hey, next year's defense in 2017 might even be better than the unit we had in 2016. Also, Big Ten Network's Jerry DiNardo noted 3-hour practice at Michigan. Now, we've heard about these long practices, but DiNardo points out that they're done very uniquely. 3 different fields. And so the coaching staff essentially is given like a split squad in a spring training game. They're split up into a threesome. And that way, maximum amount of teaching goes on, maximum amount of reps for even young players that maybe aren't going to factor in heavily on the depth chart and come into play. You know that clip we played last week of Joe Klatt of Fox News? And we said, man, we hope this guy is prophetic when he says this. He said he thought Jim Harbaugh and his staff did the best job of developing talent of any team in college football. Well, one tool that you may have at your disposal to live up to that is you're not just doing 3-hour practices where guys are just running more gassers than everybody else, but you have split your team up onto different fields so that they're each getting the instruction and the reps and the accountability from the coaching staff that they need. And most football teams, particularly by this stage of camp, you know, you've already divvied up. The most reps go to my 1s, the second most reps go to my 2s, and right on down the line. And that makes it harder for those guys that maybe aren't going to factor into the depth chart right away or maybe need more time to develop. That makes it harder for them to reach their potential. Well, if you're a young team like Michigan, if you're going to ask Eddie McDoom to go from being the jet sweep guy to now being a 30, 40, 50 catch guy, that's a big leap in any program. But maybe it's not quite as big at Michigan when the way you're constructing your practices allows for more repetitions and more time with the coaches and more teaching than you get at the vast majority of other schools. That's an excellent observation by Jerry DiNardo. He also went on to say that he thought both sides of the line of scrimmage for Michigan were deep and talented. The young players, he said, were as talented as advertised, and the young wide receiver core were impressive. So that's rhapsodic to Michigan fans. That is exactly what we wanted to hear, and we're hoping to hear once camp got underway. Next observation from DiNardo. He said Coach Don Brown, our defensive coordinator, wants to play as many as 16 to 18 guys against spread teams. But then DiNardo added this, that Michigan has that kind of depth to go that far into its two deep. And you know what? We saw this last year. And we pointed this out how many times on this podcast, these returning starters numbers, when so many of these guys played meaningful, key, vital snaps a year ago. So the returning starter number, given the amount of depth Michigan plays, because we have a coach whose outlook on football is the only way to get better at football is to play it. So a lot of guys have had meaningful game action. They're not going from nobodies to guys being counted on. Next observation. Dave Rebson pointed out in an interview, in fact, John O'Korn admitted this in his interview with Dave Rebson on Big Ten Network. He said, hey, Wilton Spate and I weren't exactly buddies while we were competing last year. I found that to be interesting because, a lot of times as fans, again, this is another fan myth. Well, guys are really competing with each other, but then they go back afterwards to the dorm or to the hotel or the team hotel or the apartments, and they hang out and they party and everybody's good buddies and everybody likes each other and everybody has the same political views and cultural views. And, it's one big happy family here on Team U, go Team U. That's not true. Sometimes these guys have dramatically different viewpoints. Sometimes they don't even like each other. These are human beings. They're not automatons. They're not robots. They have their own ideas, their own perspectives, their own set of values. And that's one of the biggest jobs for a coach, particularly at the collegiate level, as you're really starting to come into your own now as a man. And you're starting to assert yourself in those areas more than ever before. But to keep that cohesion within a team, but at the same time, not stifle that. That's part of the growing up experience. And that's something, that Coach Harbaugh values quite a bit. He does not tell his team, his players, hey, you can't have opinions. You absolutely can have opinions. Hell, I've got tons of opinions. I air them all the time. And so even last year, when they were competing, O'Korn's like, yeah, we were competing, but we didn't really care for one another all that much. Next thing that came out of the Big Ten Network's stop on the Michigan camp tour is when I watched Harbaugh being interviewed, and I've seen this a few times in the way he's addressed the media in Chicago, and really since we got into preparation for the season. He just seems to me like he's just having fun. He's having the time of his life. I mean, he was on BTN waxing poetic about Ben Mason, who may see some special teams action this year. He's got two pretty good fullbacks ahead of him. And he's talking about, hey, this guy might be my favorite player on the team. He just seemed like Jimmy. Just seemed like he's having fun, having the time of his life. Didn't seem like a guy that has one eye on the NFL, looking to bolt first chance, took this job because he didn't want to coach the Oakland Raiders. He looked like a guy having the time of his life. And again, that is music to your ears if you are a Michigan fan. Howard Griffith also compared Michigan's defensive line favorably to Ohio State's because he thinks he came out of the Ohio State camp thinking they had the best defensive line in the conference. That's good news. He also singled out Devin Bush for praise, and that's a player we've been hearing a lot about through the spring and throughout fall camp. And he's not the tallest guy out there, but he gives Michigan something in the middle that, Kenny Demmons did this a little bit, but probably since David Harris has Michigan really had a thumper right there in the middle of the defense. And let's hope, given his stature, that Devin Bush can hold up with the kind of physical play that he brings to the table. Final observation, Dave Rebson says, and this is an understatement, quote, Michigan has a lot of guys that can really play. Are you sure, Dave? Because all I've heard all offseason is everybody good left. You can't rebuild. Somehow Ohio State's allowed to go from losing everybody in the NFL draft to the college football playoff, but Michigan's taking a big step back, and Harbaugh can't coach because all he does is finish third place in the Big Ten East every year. Are you sure, Dave? You sure they got a lot of guys that can play? Because that doesn't seem to be the narrative that's out there amongst the college football media industrial complex. Is Dave Rebson right? Does Michigan have a lot of guys that can play? We'll find out as we get a mid-camp progress report from Chris Balas of the Wolverine next.
3rd and 9. Michigan needs to get to the 15 to keep it alive. And he throws. It's caught by Edwards. It's in the end zone. Touchdown.
Michigan must go for two. They're 2 for 3 going for two this year. All pass attempts.
Back here on Michigan Podcast with Chris Balas from the Wolverine. And yes, we are absolutely going to get a mid-camp check-in from Chris. But Chris, we got to get to a far more important story now that we have you here with us. Because if I have my history right, I do believe you are a proud working alumnus of the Let's Go Blue store in suburban Grand Rapids, Michigan back in the day. Is that true, Chris?
Absolutely, man. In fact, I managed that store for several summers when I was in college and had a ball with it, man. Now, the owner, who was Dave Derwich, passed away a few years ago, unfortunately, but he was a great friend. And in fact, I wrote a business plan to buy that store out of college, and didn't work out, and the store's no longer there. But did you used to frequent that store, Steve?
You want to know how I know this, Chris, is because when you left, Mr. Derwich brought in a few people to interview, to work, to assist him in the store. I was one of them, actually. Yeah, I worked there for a few weeks, and I really enjoyed it. But there was another young lady there that apparently was better at the job than I was. So after I was there for a few weeks, Dave said, because, he used to play the old games on the VCR on that TV behind the cashier counter, right? Yeah, he goes, man, every time I turn around, you're watching the games on the counter and not working. All right, so you have to go away now, which I think was his way. And he gave me a Go Blue. I think that was his way of firing me at the time, Chris.
Well, if the girl was nice looking, then you didn't have a shot.
That's true. And as I recall, Michelle Rodriguez was her name. We went to high school together, and yes, she was not displeasing to look at. Yes, so
no shot at all. And what are you supposed to do when they put on a Michigan game, right behind you?
I know. I mean, it's the middle of summer. Do I want to ring up a T-shirt or watch Rick Leach drop a dime on Ohio State again? That's a pretty easy call, right? Especially when you're 17 years old. I mean, we're victims here, Chris. Victims of our own allegiance to our favorite school. We can't be held accountable for our lack of productivity. That's how it works nowadays. Exactly. All right, so now that we've got something in common, you actually worked at this place where I got fired from, and we've made a love connection. Let's talk about the team. I was joking at the top of the show today, going back to when I used to do sports talk radio. There's two constants in college sports fandom. One is, after your team wins a bowl game, they're a young team who has everybody coming back next year. That's one. The other is, so somehow the NFL is drafting guys that didn't play on any good teams because all the good players keep coming back. The other thing that we always hear is the young guys were more highly recruited and they're faster and they're athletic, right? Okay, so we've heard this a lot within Michigan fandom this offseason, but watching the BTN crews report over the weekend, and if you've watched, I've watched them every year they've started this, DiNardo has been no fluffer of the Wolverines. In fact, you can tell there is some major bromantion going on between him and Mark. He loves him some Mark D'Antonio. There's no doubt about that, okay? But him and Griffith were both adamant, and Revson as well. I mean, Griffith went so far as to say he thought several of these young players were better than the guys Michigan lost. I know we kind of rolled our eyes last January when Chris Wormley, on his way out the door to the NFL, said, I think they might be better on defense next year. We're like, okay, yeah, whatever. But could there be some truth to this, Chris, now that we're halfway through camp?
The guys that played on the defensive line, especially number one, were backups last year, but they were essentially a number one offensive line, or defensive line rather, in their own right, because these guys could have started for most teams in the Big Ten and a lot of teams in the country. So Mo Hurst, for example, who didn't win any all Big Ten honors and probably should have, and he pretty much said as much on Twitter, comes back as probably the number one defensive tackle prospect in the country in terms of getting to the quarterback. So, these guys are plenty hungry and plenty experienced, and that's what Don Brown has said all along, Michigan's defensive coordinator, that, hey, you can talk about we only have one starter coming back, but let's be honest here, a lot of these guys have experience. Now, the biggest concern is on the defense and the secondary, and they've got guys. We've heard that Mike Zordich, the cornerbacks coach, has had his head in his hands a few times and is worried a little bit about how his young corners are faring against some of the very talented wide receivers, young but talented wide receivers. So we'll have to see how that shakes out, and we'll have to see about the depth there at that position too, because nobody's played there. But as far as athleticism is concerned, I don't think there's any question that the guys they're bringing in now are probably a little bit above, a notch above some of these guys, a lot of whom are now playing in the NFL.
So a question I got a few weeks ago on the Michigan podcast about the DBs, I'll throw it your way, Chris, get your response. One of our viewers asked me, hey, is it easier for freshmen to come in and contribute when you play a more aggressive scheme, when you're playing man-to-man more often, as opposed to when you're playing a more complicated scheme with zone coverages and communication and being in the right spot at the right time and anticipation. Maybe it just takes more time to develop those instincts. Experience is more of a factor. Does that rule of thumb apply here, or because of sort of this hybrid of blitzing scheme, but with complicated coverages behind it that Don Brown plays, is that maybe tried and true as a mitigated somewhat?
I think it's a fair question. I think it's a great question, as a matter of fact. But you're putting these young guys on an island now. You remember the Michigan State game a couple of years ago when they couldn't run the ball, and their offense was to throw against Jordan Lewis to Aaron Burbridge and throw up some of those 50-50 balls, which we're going to see from Penn State and some other teams this year. Those guys are on an island, and they're going to have to rise to the occasion. So, and what Don Brown told the Big Ten Network guys the other day, he said, we're not scaling anything back. He said we are going to probably blitz 52% of the time. He said he likes 1 out of every 2. That's great. He said, but they're not going to back down on the 90% press coverage either. So there's still a lot to learn. It's not just, okay, go there and cover this guy, cover that guy. Those 4 guys have got to start learning how to work together, and there's absolutely no chemistry among them. I remember talking to Marcus Ray in the offseason and saying, how hard is it when you have 4 guys that have never played together before to really get going right from the get-go? And he said there's going to be a learning curve there. And we're starting to hear some of that from camp, that the front 7 is looking really good, that the back 4 has some work to do. In terms of, not playing a whole lot of zone, I understand that argument as well, but do I think it's any easier? Absolutely not, because there's just that much more pressure on those guys to perform when you're playing press man coverage 90% of the time.
The one thing I think, regardless of that whole zone or man-to-man with young DB argument, that you fall, whichever side of that argument you fall down on, I think every defensive coach in America for any team, if you took them aside and asked them, hey, would you rather have a dominant front 7 and a bunch of question marks in the secondary, or a dominant secondary and a bunch of question marks in the front 7? Chris, all of them. Every day and twice on Sunday are taking the dominant front 7. So that's the one plus we do have going for us here, don't you think?
Yeah, without question. And you look at that front 4, for example, those guys should be dominant. You've got 4 guys that can rush the passer. Brian Monet is an absolute load. I don't know if you've seen him recently, but to plug the middle. But then you've got 3 guys and guys behind them like Carlo Kemp that are really coming on and emerging as pass rushers. So, hey, if you get there, before they can get rid of the ball, then you're helping out your secondary. And, of course, that's cliche and it's common sense, but that's just the way it is. And we saw it last year. We've seen it under Don Brown at Boston College, at Michigan, having those dominant front 7s, even if these guys aren't highly recruited, scheme-wise or whatever, getting to the quarterback is really going to help those young guys, whether it's David Long and Lavert Hill, Keith Washington, whoever they throw out there. And I'm just as anxious as anybody else to see who it is that starts out there in that first game against Florida. They've got a lot of different options.
Chris Balas from the Wolverine, our guest here this week on Michigan Podcast, sort of a mid-camp check-in on the Wolverines. Now, we're entering that period of camp now where I think, we read reports on various websites, including yours. Sean McKeon kind of flashed early on, one of the young tight ends. And one of the things I posted on Twitter is my own experience covering college football for several years, not Michigan, but other college teams, is wait on those kinds of players until we get more than halfway through camp, because sometime a guy could come in, maybe just has a hot streak, maybe he's just kind of feeling it, maybe whatever reps they were doing or whatever plays they were focused on were kind of in his wheelhouse. After a while, water will reach its level, particularly when we reach the dog days of camp that we're entering into now, and that's when you're going to really find out who's emerging and who's not, because here's the other thing to keep in mind too. Every time we see a video of Oliver Martin jumping over a couple of Wolverine DBs, well, that's a great play, but that also means those DBs didn't make a good play. When you watch Aubrey Solomon throwing somebody to the ground, that's Ben Bredesen. That's our own offensive lineman. So we always have to kind of temper what we feel about and think about these highlights in August when we're not looking at preseason games where we're doing this to guys in other uniforms, but we're doing this to the guys in our own. So how do you guys at the Wolverine, how do you filter in and around that, knowing that for every positive action, that's a negative reaction to somebody wearing the same uniform and vice versa?
That's a great question, too, and we were talking about this at lunch today, as a matter of fact. You talk about the Oliver Martin play, for example, and I don't care who the defensive back is. When you're reaching over somebody like that and making an athletic play like he did, that's a great catch. But The guys got us back to the play, and I don't even remember who the defensive back was. I didn't catch the number in the play, but I'm thinking, man, no wonder Mike Zordich has his head in his hands, because that's poor defense. Yes, it was a great athletic play, but that's poor defense. And you're wondering if these young wide receivers are just that good. From everything we've heard, they're outstanding. Donovan Peoples-Jones, we've heard Tariq Black, who was a 4-star, not a 5-star like Peoples-Jones, is even better than Donovan Peoples-Jones has been, that this kid's going to be an absolute stud, that Nico Collins, another 4-star, is going to play, that they have so many wide receivers now that it's really tough for these young defensive backs. At the same time, these guys are still true freshmen. You would love to see these young guys, these cornerbacks like David Long, like Lavert Hill, have a little bit more success to feel a lot better about going into the season. So the same way with the offensive line and the defensive line. Maurice Hurst talked about the offensive line, and he said this is the most improved position group that we've seen. Well, it couldn't have been much worse, let's be honest. They weren't terrible, but they weren't great by Michigan standards, which is where they need to be to win championships. So they talk about iron sharpening iron and everything else, but I think it's really good for the offensive line, for example, to be going against what should be one of the best front fours in the country, because I don't think they'll face another one like that all year until they get to Ohio State. It's only going to make them better. But I think it's a great question, and there is cause for concern, at least from what we understand in the secondary when it comes to covering that plethora of receivers that they have out there.
Wilton Speight in the offense. Is he being unfairly maligned? I mean, let's face it, he was brutal. I mean, he was brutal, 2 words, in the spring game. And I'm always telling fans, don't make too much out of the spring game when some guy does great. When it's set up, well, if he does great when it's set up for him to be great, that's good. When he does bad when it's set up for him to be great, that's not good. And that was not an inspiring performance. But you go back and look at what he did in game action last year. Now, Iowa, he wasn't good, but the entire offense wasn't good. Florida State, I thought his performance in that game, given the sieve-like blocking that went on in the first half, was pretty damn close to heroic. I thought his performance against Ohio State, given coming off the injury and the caliber of defense he was playing in that environment, was heroic. That pass he made in overtime there to tie it was one of the most clutch passes I've seen. Maybe that might be the most clutch pass a Michigan quarterback has thrown since Chad Henne was in a Michigan uniform. But still, his numbers, I think he led the Big Ten in third down passing efficiency. He was third team all Big Ten. But there's this notion out there that he's reached his ceiling. Other guys maybe that have been more highly recruited see that as Brandon Peters are going to be required of that spot to go to the next level. I know this. Most fans would take 18 touchdowns and 7 interceptions right now. But given the lack of proven productivity around him, you do get the sense if this team's going to meet expectations, he's going to have to be better than that, Chris.
Yeah, without question, and he's going to have to take another step. But how many people expected him to be in this situation? I think I wrote it one time that he would never take a meaningful snap at Michigan, and obviously I was proven wrong there, and gladly so. He's a great kid, and he's a great leader, and the kids love him. So I do think that he was unfairly criticized in a lot of ways. And if you look at the spring game, you look at the defense that he was going with compared to who Brandon Peters was going against, who John O'Korn was going against. He was facing the number 1 defense. Khalid Hudson was in there all the time. Rashawn Gary getting after him. Maurice Hurst, they were right in his grill. And that is not to try to defend what he did. He had a terrible game. There's no question about it. And I know that the coaching staff, too, was not pleased with him because they understand, and Jim Harbaugh more than anybody understands, that you have got – if you're the Michigan quarterback, you have got to want to win at everything you do. That's whether it's hot dog eating contest, whether it is the spring game, no matter what. And didn't get that sense from Wilton Speight after that game when he kind of said, well, it is just the spring game. It's really not that big of a deal. It was a big deal to them. But from what we understand, he's done everything right in the summer. He has the trust of his teammates. And in speaking to these guys on and off the record, on the record, you're not going to get much honesty, let's be honest, in a camp. But off the record, when you talk to these guys, they say this guy's taken another step in the right direction, is really doing a great job with these young receivers, considering that he hasn't thrown to them in game situations before. So flat out, Wilton Speight's going to be your quarterback. I don't think it's a real close competition. I think John O'Korn has made strides, but Wilton Speight's the guy, and I expect him to take steps forward. And let's be honest here, he was one badly called game against Ohio State from reaching the Big Ten championship game in his first year. There is no reason that he cannot lead this team to a title.
Who are the go-to? We have a lot of potential, a lot of talent on that side of the ball and both sides of the ball. But the question really, I think, becomes who does what? What are the roles? I was just watching the other day the 2002 Washington-Michigan game when Phil Brabbs came off the bench after shaking a couple of kicks and hit that clutch kick right there to win it at the very end. And I was reminded that whenever number 27, Calvin Bell, came in the game, it was either an end around or a fake end around. That was his role. And if Michigan fans, you kind of see that all the time. You roll your eyes when we know what's coming. But there's a certain comfort in guys knowing what their roles are. So 3rd and 3. Who's the running back that ekes out an extra yard? 3rd and 5. Who's the go-to wide receiver? Who's the guy that stretches the defense so one of this battalion of tight ends can find some open space, mid-range underneath? Who are those guys? Do we know that yet, Chris?
Yeah, I don't think we do. And that's the beauty of this team and what they're talking about is that they've got so many options now. Eddie McDoom's going to be your Calvin Bell, right? The guy that goes into the game and you know that he's going to run a reverse or he's going to be that guy that runs the end around. But who's going to emerge as that number one receiver? And I've written this. I think it's going to be the first year ever that a freshman receiver leads this team in receiving. Now, you've got Grant Perry coming back, who is still somewhat of a role player, but you've got such explosive guys like Donovan Peoples-Jones and Tariq Black, like who we mentioned before. I think one of those guys is going to emerge as the number one receiver on this team, which is a little bit scary. What you're asking of a true freshman when you've had guys like Anthony Carter been here in his first year, did some good things and a couple great things, but didn't put it all together for an entire year. Braylon Edwards barely did anything in his first year. David Terrell, of course, had other guys playing in front of him. See, that's where we're a little bit different right now. You don't have any proven receivers coming back. So I think it's going to be one of those true freshmen. And when it comes to running backs, I don't think Ty Isaac, for his size, is really that one guy who gets going quickly enough that he's going to get you that yard. We've heard Kareem Walker hits the hole really well, that he's really improved in that area. But your two guys are going to be Chris Evans and Karan Higdon. Chris Evans can make a guy miss if he gets into the backfield. You don't have a whole lot of guys on this team. I think Higdon and Evans are really the two right now that can really make a guy miss. So those are going to be your go-tos. I think Chris Evans is going to lead this team in rushing. I think Karan Higdon, though, is going to be one of the bigger surprises on this team and what he brings. He really came back in great shape, has had a really good camp. Again, off the record and speaking to a lot of people, he is right there with Evans as a guy that you really want in that game who has really taken a step in terms of maturity and improving and upping his game.
2 more questions for Chris Balas of the Wolverine, who's our guest on this week's episode of Michigan Podcast. And you seem like the perfect person to ask this question of, Chris, as the guy who correctly prognosticated that Wilton Spate would never take a meaningful snap in a Michigan uniform. So let's go ahead and pronounce judgment on future players right now on August the 15th. Can you give me one guy on each side of the ball that you think fans are not expecting enough from, number one, and are expecting too much from, number 2, on both offense and defense?
Sure. I'll go on defense first. I think Michael Dwumfer is a guy that a lot of people they brought in just to get Rashawn Gary, 3-star defensive tackle, and I don't think that he took that very well. And he really went out in the offseason and changed his body, has really become kind of explosive. And talking to Brian Monet, he said, everybody's talking about guys behind us. He said Michael Dwumfer might be one of the most improved guys on this team. I think he's really going to help. Lawrence Marshall being another. He's kind of a forgotten guy who started at defensive end. I know you only asked for one, but I'm going to give you 2 on the defensive side of the ball. I think those 2 guys right there are really going to have really upped their games and had great summers to the point that they're really going to contribute on this team, and they're really going to need them to. So, and then on offense, everybody's talking about Pat Kugler at center and how important he is, and obviously that's true. They're saying, if he can just hold up and if he can just be decent. I think he's going to be better than that, and has really kind of shown that in the early parts of camp that he's really not a concern anymore to a lot of these guys. They said he's been really, really good at times, and when you're going against a guy like Brian Monet, who looks like he's about 330, 340 pounds now, and was throwing Mason Cole around during not this spring game but the last spring game after Cole had moved to center, if you're holding your own against a guy like that, you're going to do some pretty good things in the Big Ten. I think he's going to be one of the unsung heroes of this team, and if they win a title, I think Pat Kugler is going to be a big reason why.
And then is there a player on both sides of the ball, Chris, that you think fans maybe need to pump the brakes on a little bit?
The corners, again, David Long got a lot of, and we were guilty of that too, pumping him up. The young corners really have a lot to prove, in my opinion, and these guys were highly rated, highly recruited. We heard good things from the coaches about them. I think that I'm in wait-and-see mode on both of those guys because of who they're replacing. Jordan Lewis and Channing Stribling were so good last year. Those guys have a long way to go, in my opinion. And I still want to see a little bit more of Chris Evans. I think that Chris Evans has the potential to be a great back, has to break a few more tackles. And, there were a couple times he got caught by the feet last year. This guy averaged 7 yards a carry. Most of them came against not so good teams. So he's got to prove to me that he can be that big-time back in a big-time game. And, of course, a lot of that depends on the blocking up front. But I think he's got great potential. Still want to see a little bit more from him before I anoint him the next great Michigan back.
Final question then, Chris, the Florida game. And I think this is pivotal, not just because it's the season opener, not just because it's another national program, but the way Michigan's schedule is constructed. It's heavily backloaded in terms of the toughest opponents, most of them anyway. Most Michigan fans essentially have 4 games, Florida, Wisconsin, Penn State, and Ohio State, and a tier separate from the other 8. Well, 3 of those 4 are going to happen in the last third of the season, which gives you a lot of time to find out if Keith Washington is really a guy that's just good, or is he good because the young guys aren't ready? And can David Long and Lavert Hill get ready? Well, that gives you 6, 7, 8 games to figure out some of the answers to those questions. If you can get by this one, then you're figuring out the answers to those questions as probably by the time we get to that part of the season, somewhere around the top 5 in the rankings when the college football playoff rankings come out, which then means that you're in a place where even if you lose one of those, you don't fall so far that you're both still in the Big Ten race and in the playoff race, but you got to get past this game. Florida's a team that has so many of the same questions Michigan does, except they have a quarterback question that we don't have with Wilton Spate, and of course then bringing in Malik Zaire and the redshirt freshman Felipe Franks and everything else. You throw in now the loss of clearly their best receiver, although that's a unit where they have other talented guys, but those aren't talented guys, much like we were just talking about with Michigan, that aren't used to having the offense revolve around them the way Antonio Callaway has as Florida's leading receiver the last 2 years. How do you see that game? Because the way I see it, I think both teams have intangibles in their favor. Florida, Michigan named the score on them 2 years ago. The SEC teams do not like being underdogs to Big Ten teams. Michigan, though, a lot of people aren't talking about this. The Wolverines lost 3 of their last 4 games. Lose this, and you've lost 4 of your last 5. So I would believe there's a chip on the shoulder there for the Maize and Blue as well. How do you see it, Chris?
Absolutely, and I think it'll be a lower scoring game. I really do. I think that there are athletes on both sides, on both defenses, that are going to make it hard to move the ball for offenses that have, the skill positions are a little bit challenged. Michigan with youth and Florida just doesn't really have the playmakers that we're used to seeing. This isn't Florida under Steve Spurrier, for example. This is a team that has a lot of question marks too. But I like Jim Harbaugh in a matchup like this. I think it comes down to coaching and Don Brown and that Michigan defense. I think is going to make it hard on those Florida quarterbacks to really move the ball. So you got to protect the ball. That's one thing that Wilton Spate did not do well in the Michigan losses, all by 1 score or less, all right down to the wire. You've got to protect the ball if you want to win those games. One less pass out of the end zone that gets picked off against Ohio State, and you're winning that game by 2 scores. Mm-hmm. So that's what I'm seeing, and I do agree with you that the intangibles, the Florida intangibles, are already talking about that. This 2 years ago, this and that. But when it comes right down to it, after that first hit, that's all out the window, and it's all about X's and O's and execution. So I think this is a game that Michigan can win. I think it's a game that Michigan should win, and I think there's no question that Wilton Spate will be the guy that's taking the snaps in that game. That's an advantage for Michigan. I think Michigan fans even don't really understand how big of an advantage that is. I think he's geared up to have a pretty good season.
Chris Balas from the Wolverine, very gracious with his time this week on Michigan Podcast. Chris, it was an honor. You guys do great work. I have been a subscriber going back to when it was just Borton in that newspaper back in the 90s when you were figuring out business plans for the Let's Go Blue store. So thanks for being with us, Chris.
And arranging to fire you from Let's Go Blue, right?
Thank you, man. God bless and go Blue. Take care.
Thank you, man.
All right, we'll come back. More Michigan Podcast in a moment.
Better. Their defense is for real. We all knew that. Chad Henne will get better, and they've got game breakers at wide receiver.
Jackson blitzing. Here he comes. He's got a shot at him, and Tate got it off, but it's intercepted. Picked off by Grant Mason, and Mason battles inside the 5. Got it. Mason, touchdown on the interception.
Pressure coming from the backside. Ball thrown behind the receiver. Tate tries to pick it up. Throws the ball to a spot. It's the wrong spot in Grant Mason. Look at this. Look at the Michigan defenders trying to find blocks. Look at that guy's elbow right in the middle of that picture. But he gets it. Drew Tate tries to throw it just a little bit early than he had to, and it gets picked off.
So Grant Mason, who transferred from Stanford after 2 seasons with the Cardinal, picks one off and then battles to the high line. And Michigan leads it 30-10.
This week's Twitter results from our followers at Michigan Podcast. We asked you, based on what you're hearing / reading, what's the biggest story of Michigan football's fall camp thus far? 11% of you said the so-called quarterback battle. And I say so-called because I've never really believed it really is one. 22% of you said questions at defensive back. You just heard Chris Balas from the Wolverine say that's their primary focus where he works. 27% said new players emerging. 40% gave a good answer, though, too. That is the development of the offensive line. That is the position group that has held this program back more than any other in the post-Bo era. And for those of you that are new to the Michigan Podcast, I kind of consider 1969 to 2007 the Bo era because Mo and Lloyd both came from the Bo tree and right from within the program as well. And so that was the position that really Bo built his Michigan program on, that sustained itself well into the Lloyd Carr years. It's held the program back, though. Yes, we've got 19 guys in NFL training camps. Yes, we had 11 guys drafted more than any other school, but none of them that were drafted were offensive linemen. All the guys that were on the offensive line that are in camps were all undrafted free agents. So that clearly tells you that the talent level at that vital position just wasn't where it was at with the rest of the team. So I would agree with those of you that are focused on the offensive line. I think that is the position group that will determine how Harbaugh goes from rebuilding the brand, making this a good college football program again, to joining the nation's elite. This week's question from our listeners / viewers here on the Michigan Podcast. Matt Johnson wants to know if I heard anything at all about Ambry Thomas. Michigan coaches aren't talking about him for cornerback anymore. Is he injured? He is not injured. Ambry Thomas, of course, one of the most highly recruited corners in the Midwest, maybe in the country, in the class of 2017. Early enrollee out of Detroit. I just think it's kind of a jumbled mess there right now. You just heard Chris Balas of the Wolverine talk about that. They had 2 guys that were also very highly recruited, another fellow Detroit kid, Lavert Hill, and then David Long out of California. I think the expectation, or at least the hope, was that those guys would get groomed for a year and would be ready to step right in. Like, for example, what you're going to see out of Khaleke Hudson and Devin Bush. Doesn't sound like we're quite there yet. Now, hopefully, that week 1 against Florida, even without Antonio Callaway, they're going to have some very talented receivers. But what's the timing level there at the quarterback position? If it's Felipe Franks, he's never played a college football game. So you're not sure that he hits the ground running. If it's Malik Zaire, well, as I've pointed out to you guys before, he's really played 3.5 games of meaningful action. He played a couple of spot plays against Texas last year, and that's it. He's been on campus for a few weeks. Well, Jake Rudock was only on campus for a few weeks. Well, 2 things. 1, Jake Rudock was playing in the exact same offense, just with better coaching that he was playing at Iowa. 2, do you guys remember how Jake Rudock played the first few weeks? All right, Jake Rudock threw 3 interceptions against Utah. You guys were screaming at me on Twitter, why aren't we benching him? All right, so he was not good the first few weeks. Now, the last month of the year, he made himself NFL money. He was tremendous. But the first few weeks, he was not very good. And he was not very good stepping into a system exactly like what he was running at Iowa. Well, Malik Zaire is stepping in for a few weeks running a totally different system than when he was running at Notre Dame. So that could be the one saving grace. That could offset some of the questions Michigan has in the secondary, because Florida's passing game is probably going to be a lot better 4 or 5 weeks from now than it will be that very first week of the season.
Double tight end on first down. The pitch back to Henson. They've been working on it. Henson going for it all. He's got Terrell in the end zone. Touchdown! The MVP of last year's Orange Bowl is off to a quick start. 31-yard touchdown catch for David Terrell.
We've seen this type of catch many times from David Terrell. The Ohio State game, the winning catch against Wisconsin, and watch the way he plays the ball in the air. Harry Catcher all over him. The arm strength for Henson was a key as well.
Quick reminder, those of you that have been asking, hey, can we get more of the content you guys are producing and how can we support you? How can we help you out? Well, we just launched a page on Patreon. So if you're willing to help us out, even if it's just $1 a month, we would greatly appreciate it to make it, to support the effort. It takes a lot of work. Actually, particularly all the video and everything else that Aaron, our producer, edits each week. It takes a lot of work to put this on. It's a labor of love, though. But hey, if you guys decide the worker's worth is higher and we want to throw something back as a thank you for supporting the Wolverines and keeping us informed, we would greatly appreciate that. And then if you decide to be a $5 a month contributor to what we're doing here via Patreon, you're going to get exclusive access to our Game Day Reaction podcast, audio-only podcast we'll put together after every Michigan game this season, as well as my Stone Cold Locks and Stone Cold Upsets and Lead Pipe Locks picks that I make Thursdays and Fridays during the college football season. We'll give you guys access to those as well. Again, if you want to do that, the description for how to get access to our Patreon page is right here. The link is in the description right here on YouTube to that page, or you can just search Michigan Podcast via Patreon as well. All right, last thing before we get out of here. I probably shouldn't tell you this before you see them. But what you're about to see was actually designed by an Ohio State fan. I know. Your maize and blue spidey sense is tingling. But I want you to check these out. An Ohio State fan put together his own mock-up of potential Michigan alternate uniforms that they say they're going to wear for at least one home game this year. And I got to tell you, man, those are sweet. I should not like them. Because, I'm getting older now. I'm 44. I just turned 44 a couple weeks ago. I'm becoming get off my lawn guy. So I'm one of those, don't mess with the home uniforms. They're sacred. And I still think that. But if you were to mess with the home uniforms, just for once, you could do worse than that. I mean, I think those look pretty tight. Do the kids still say tight? I dropped dope on my teenager the other day. She's like, you're too old to say that. I'm like, are you kidding me? We were saying dope before you were born. All right, so I can't keep up with what means cool is lit. Lit's like the new dope, right? Those are lit. Those are pretty good. So not bad, especially for an Ohio State fan. That's going to do it for this week's episode of Michigan Podcast. Thank you for joining us right here. Don't forget to share, subscribe here on YouTube, share the link, like the video, do the same via iTunes, Google Play, and Stitcher as well. We will see you next week. Thanks to Chris Balas of the Wolverine for joining us. Go Blue.